So I would now like to introduce our speaker for the session, the IWRC's own board president, Adam Grogan. Besides his role at the IWRC, Adam works for the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or RSPCA, in the United Kingdom. First as their wildlife rehabilitation coordinator, and now as their head of wildlife. Mr. Grogan advises on policy and facilitates research into the welfare of wild animals in the rehabilitation process. Adam is also served as the vice chair and honorary secretary for the Mammalian Society for Britain and Ireland, and also sits on the executive committee of the British Council for Wildlife Rehabilitation. Today, he will present on the 5 domains and how rehabilitators can use them to support something we all care a great deal about, the welfare of injured or orphaned animals. So now I will hand the floor over to Adam. Adam, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Aya, and thank you very much, everybody, for attending. So now this is where we pray that what happened a few minutes ago when I shared my screen will work. So hopefully you can now see the presentation.
It looks great.
Excellent, thank you very much. So, as I has said, the title of this presentation is basically how rehabilitators can use the 5 domains model to assess animal welfare. The RSPCA in the UK is looking to use the 5 domains a lot more in its work. And I'll come on to more about the 5 domains in a minute, but it's very key in terms of trying to understand how we can assess animal welfare for all the animals that we have in our care. And I will state I'm not an expert in it. I have had to learn in terms of to understand how we can apply this model in what we do, but I would definitely point you all to papers, certainly by David Mellor and his colleagues based at Massey University in New Zealand, and we can provide a list of those papers to go with the talk. So basically the structure of the talk is we're going to talk about the 5 freedoms and then the 5 needs as they are, then quality of life, and then how that leads into the 5 domains model. So many of you have probably heard of the term the 5 freedoms. The 5 freedoms came about from a report into farm animal welfare in the UK by Bramble in 1966. And in that report, they talk about the fact that many of the farm animals in the UK lacked basic freedoms. And in 1979, the Farm Animal Welfare Council took this further and developed what they called the 5 freedoms. And the 5 freedoms were a breakthrough in how we consider animal welfare. So on the screen, you can see basically they are the freedom from hunger and thirst, the freedom from discomfort, the freedom from injury, disease, the freedom to express normal behavior, and the fear from fear and distress, freedom from fear and distress. However, one of the problems with the 5 freedoms is that although they are very good at highlighting animal welfare and what we should do to address negative consequences, they do focus really only on the negative experiences of the animal, and they don't consider the positive experiences of the animal. In the UK, when the Animal Welfare Act was being written in 2006, the opportunity was taken to update the 5 freedoms. And this came out in Section 9 of the Act as the 5 needs. You can see they're very similar to the 5 freedoms in that there is the need for an animal to have a suitable diet, to have a suitable environment, to be protected from pain, injury, and suffering, to be housed with other animals, conspecifics, if that is the animal's normal behavior, or not to be kept with them, if that's the animal's normal behavior, and to be able to exhibit normal behavior patterns. But one of the problems, again, with the 5 needs is that it's very perhaps easy for a keeper to meet the needs of an animal. But does that mean that the animal will have a good life, or will it just have a life? So we can provide animals with a carefully balanced diet that is nutritionally very good for the animal, and we could feed the animal with that diet every day. but would the animal enjoy that, or would the animal want more variety? And I think one of the things that's often been a problem for animal behaviorists in the past is being wary of anthropomorphizing, in that if, say, we had two groups of rats in a cage, and we fed these rats were normally fed with diet X, and then we split the rats in two so that we had two groups of rats in two different cages, with one being fed diet X and then one having a choice between diet X and diet Y. If the second group of rats fed on diet Y, we would say often that there is a nutritional need for them to do so, rather than trying to look to see if the animals actually just wanted a change and they preferred diet Y to diet X, having been eating diet X for some time. And I think that's one of the things we can forget about, is that we can provide animals with what they need, but that may not necessarily always be what they want. And perhaps if you wanted a human example, we can eat perfectly balanced diets ourselves, but we enjoy a bit of chocolate, cheesecake, whatever you happen to like. But you all know that makes life just that little bit better. So then the Farm Animal Council has then sort of gone on to consider, well, if you're looking at an animal's life, how can you basically better describe it? So with them, they've decided, with the report that they produced in 2009, to basically consider 3 ways where we could consider quality of life. So basically they said that a life is not worth living if the animal is unable to do anything that it might want to do. So for example, to fly or to reproduce, to play, due to the situation that it's in. An animal could have a life worth living if the animal is able to do, if the animal is able to meet a lot of its needs. Of course, animals may have wants as well as needs, and a life worth living may give the animal some of its wants, but perhaps not all of its wants. So it can have a life, and it could potentially have a life worth living, but it could still be improved upon. Of course, any definition of what a life worth living is depends entirely on the judgment necessarily made by us, acting on behalf of the animal's interests. And where there is doubt, it's the animal and the animal's welfare that should have the benefit. And we should also need to consider that the animal's experiences have to come together over its lifetime. So it can have good experiences and it can have bad experiences, but over the period of time, so for some animals, it could be its lifetime, but perhaps in wildlife rehabilitation, it would be the duration that the animal is in care. You would ideally want the balance of the animal's experiences to be positive during that time, accepting that there may have to be some negative ones if that happens. And then you could have a good life. And the good life is where the animal has choice, or indeed agency, in what it does, what it eats, and it can be kept in such a way that pain, discomfort, and stress are minimized, if not removed. So we can define what quality of life would look like, but how can we measure it? Oh, I've pressed the wrong thing. So the 5 domains gives us an opportunity to measure that. It was initially developed in the 1990s and has developed in many ways since then. Note that one of the corners behavior is now called behavioral interactions. So the 5 domains builds on the 5 freedoms, and if you go away and compare the two, you'll see similarities. But the 5 domains is not another way of thinking about animal welfare, but it's been designed as a way to measure it, specifically to give us a tool to look at how we can measure quality of life. It recognizes that animals are kept in different situations, but despite this, there is a need to minimize suffering and promote positive states in the animals. Consideration needs to be given to how the animal feels about its situation, and that in turn requires consideration in terms of our assessment of how we treat the animal. And so it's very much dependent on feelings, as I said, and that is what we need to look at. And we can then assess to see whether or not we are making a genuine positive welfare impact. So these are the 5 domains. So again, nutrition, environment, health, behavioural interactions, and the mental state. And the way that this chart is structured, it basically shows that the first 4 all feed into the 5th. So basically the experiences that the animal has regarding its diet or regarding its environment all affect how the animal feels about its life, if you like. And domains 1 to 3 are things that we, as carers or keepers, usually have control over if the animal is in captivity. So in terms of diet, we feed the animal, we provide it with water. We may try and provide the animal with varied diet, or we may be very restricted in terms of the diet we provide. We can provide the animal with barren enclosures, or we can provide them with stimulating enclosures. And in terms of health and welfare, we will medicate the animal if the animal needs medication, we will treat it if it needs treating, and so on. The 4th domain, the behavioural interactions, describes how the animal's reactions to how it lives. As a result, it has some choice, again, or agency is the word used in this. So therefore, it can decide what it wants to do in relation to the environment or to the diet that it's being given. And domain 4 in the behavioural interactions has been expressed in terms of how the animal reacts to different stimuli. And this can be how they interact with the environment that's given to them, with other non-human animals, and with humans. So these, but especially domain 4, can then give us an indication of how the animal is feeling. So, for example, if we look at an animal environment, and we say we provided the animal with a barren, unheated cage with no conspecifics in an area where it can smell or see a predator, and that could be someone who is constantly talking loudly and angrily in the vicinity, we would then expect some of the feelings that this animal might be experiencing to be those in red. If it's not warm, then it's going to be cold. If it could be anxious, it could be fearful. It's going to be suffering from stress. So these are sorts of feelings that we would expect to see in this animal from this. If, however, we provided a more varied enclosure that allowed the animal to express more natural behaviours, and an enclosure that is not in sight, smell, or sound of predators, including people, then we would expect some of the more behaviours to come through that we would see in terms of it being comfortably warm, it being relaxed, well rested, interested and engaged. If we had it with conspecifics, then it would show in its behaviour to its conspecifics. So we have ways of basically looking to see how we can see how the animal is feeling in terms of its behaviour. And this is why behavioural interactions are important. And then we can then basically express this in, as I said, in terms of the barren environment. It could show signs of being bored and helplessness. However, if we provided it with choice, then it could explore that novel environment. And that could come out in terms of positive affects, in terms of being interested and pleasantly occupied. If animal-to-animal activity is constrained, then it would thwart desires to play or reproduce. However, if it has the ability to play with another, then it can be playfulness, or it can engage with other social activities. And then in terms of engaging with people, then if somebody is nearby, being very loud, perhaps with an angry voice, then the animal could freeze, it could cower, it's going to be stressed because of that. Whereas if people around it, if there are people around it, we're always speaking in calm, encouraging voices, then you would hope that animal would then be more compliant and might seek contact if that's what you want to do with that particular animal. So therefore, the animal's behaviour may be a good indicator of how it is feeling. And we can expect both positive and negative feelings depending on the animal's experiences. So again, here, if the animal's mental state, if it's comfortably warm, if it's warm, then it's going to feel comfortable. If it's cold, then it's going to feel, uncomfortable. And basically all these things will then add up in terms of the animal's experiences, in terms of what it thinks and feels about the environment that it's in. And this therefore has a big impact on its welfare. And this slide sort of gives an example of how this would work. As I said earlier, it's going to perhaps be impossible to provide always positive experiences for an animal. For instance, an animal is going to have to feel hunger at times in order for it to want to eat. So, there will be times, I'm not sure if you can see the mouse, where food restriction is going to come in, so the animal will be hungry. But then when you feed the animal will be sated, and therefore that's a positive experience. But what we're looking to do is make sure that over the period of time, and that could be the animal's life, or as I said, from a rehabilitator's perspective, the time that the animal is in care, we would want the animal to have more positive experiences than negative experience. And this is why we would think that animals would then have a life certainly worth living, if not a good life. And so the 5 domains model allows us to measure these positive and negative experiences using gradations as described in this slide. This does need to be done objectively. So I think one of the problems that you can have with many animal carers is perhaps having an anthropomorphic idea in terms of what the animal is feeling, and perhaps also wanting the animal to mirror our feelings in terms of its situation, in that whether or not the animal is feeling positive or negative may be more about what we're feeling rather than what the animal is feeling. So there is a definite need to be objective when doing these measures. And with negative effects, you'd basically be looking to see how they are. There's 5 categories from A to E, and you would put these together with basically no negative effects at A and very severe negative effects at E. And then with the positive effects, there's 4 categories with no positive effects being felt, and then high-level positive effects being felt. And what you want is to have more positive effects and fewer negative effects in order to have good welfare. And then we can use these to then, say, determine the animal's quality of life. Starting, as I say, at the top with a good life where the animal experiences mostly positive feelings, a life worth living where the animal is experiencing more positive feelings than negative, neutral where it's about the same in terms of positive and negative effects being experienced by the animal. We would then have a life worth living, a life worth avoiding, where there's more negatives than positives in the animal's life, and then a life not worth living, where it's basically felt that the animal's experiences are going to be predominantly negative. And we can all understand the latter in terms of any wildlife rehabilitator or vet making a decision in terms of euthanasia in order to prevent any further suffering in the animal is an example of a life not worth living. But it's a question of where do you bring that criteria when you're doing that? And I think the 5 domains is a good tool for helping make some of those decisions. So in summary, the 5 domains allows us to assess an animal's welfare by providing ways to measure its quality of life. And if we're looking at this slide and starting at the top, then we're looking at the first 4 domains in terms of the nutrition, the environment, the health, and the behavioral interactions of the animal. And we can see how that feeds into its mental state. So how does the animal feel about those particular things? So as I say, if it's not got water, it will be thirsty. If it's got food, then it can be sated. In its environment, if it hasn't got heating, then it will be cold. If it has got heating, it'll be warm, and so on. And then those feed into what's the balance of feelings? How many negative feelings does it have to how many positive feelings? And as I say, the more positive feelings it has, the better the welfare, and the more we are looking at the animal having a good life, as opposed to the animal with more negative experiences having poor welfare and having a life worth avoiding, if not a life not worth living. So then that's the summary of where we are. So we're going to do a short exercise now where we're going to sort of run through a couple of sort of basic scenarios. And what we need to think about with these in terms of domains 1 to 3 are you need to think about how you would care for the animal in terms of can you provide it more variations in food or a varied environment or better pain management. Domain 4 in terms of its interactions with humans. So will these be negative? There's no previous interactions with humans, and how can you mitigate this? And then domain 5 would be, of course, think about how the animal actually feels about its situation and how can we provide a more positive experience. So that is the main part of the presentation. So Kai, shall I stop sharing now and do you want to share the spreadsheet?
Sounds great. And let's see, is the correct screen showing?
You're showing the spreadsheet, yep.
Okay, fantastic, great. And we thought we'd do this for 10, maybe 15 minutes before we go into our general discussion. No more, I think we'll max it out at 15. If it's 5 minutes, no problem. So we have, let's start with this scenario. We have 2 scenarios here, and to move us along, what I've done to start is I've created a small scenario with some nutritional, environmental, health, and behavioral interactions happening. And thought that maybe together as a group, we can think of some of the positive and negative effects that might be happening from this. They don't necessarily need to correspond right across. So either by unmuting yourself or in the chat, if you want to kind of start thinking about what are the positive and negative aspects of the mental state that we might see in this scenario, where the otter is in a very bare pre-release enclosure. It's outside near a roadway.
So please go ahead and chime in. If you don't feel like unmuting yourself or you can't, you can also post in the chat. We can fill those positive and negative affects in. Danny is wondering if it's a river otter.
Yes, let's do river otter versus sea otter. I didn't think to put that in. Yes.
Good distinction.
Well, if I start off, Kai, by sufficient food and water would be the animal is sated, it is well fed.
You guys can all see my horrible spelling here.
No.
Autumn's got some great ones here. So negative would be fear. It's amazing. I put myself on screen and my typing gets worse too, not just my spelling.
We're not watching. It's okay. But shouldn't, since we're making a chart, shouldn't fear from road noise be down there under barren and close? No, where is it? Sensory imposition from the road.
Yeah, you can do this in one of 2 ways. You can either do it that where they're right across, or these can end up being kind of big merged.
A cumulative list, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
So it can go either way. I think what you often find in the end as you create these is it becomes a cumulative list because some of the same things might happen from several of these. Like both of these will provide the animal feeling full, but only one of them might, but it's easy. I think it is very useful as you're going by to start doing it that way because you can kind of connect things.
Mm-hmm.
We've got some great new suggestions in the chat here. Not just boredom with the enclosure, but boredom with diet.
Being able to forage, wouldn't that be one of them?
Mm-hmm.
Organizing their food.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, Jean's pointing out that a consistent stress from the road noise could bring down the immune system, which might be, yeah, so not just affecting, so affecting their long-term health.
Mm-hmm.
We've got nowhere to escape and or hide if it is a barren enclosure. Again, increasing stress. And the animal may experience a need for exercise, Autumn is pointing out. They're coming in fast. Sorry, Kai, but
no, that's great. This is helping. This is wonderful.
We've got
I also
go ahead.
No, I was gonna say I've got here habituation to human noise. I put that under a negative effect. You know, not only is it the current fear and stress it might be, but it's the habituation that could cause challenges later. Thought that was a neat one. And on a positive side, we do have a second positive one. We have the companionship of having the conspecific in the enclosure. And I love that we already have several suggestions on how we can fix this. I think that's one of the great things about this exercise, as well as assessing, Adam, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as well as assessing the animal's welfare at this time, you start almost immediately seeing things that you can change to improve it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, no, that's what you would want to do from this, is basically by identifying how the animal feels about its particular situation. You would hope to then think that, well, we therefore need to change that, and start thinking about ways you can change that. So as you say, with a barren enclosure, you can start thinking about what enrichment you might need. Or from the road noise, you would basically be thinking, well, you know, we need to move the pre-release enclosures.
Yeah, things to play with. So we can kind of add that in. And should we go on to the other, any other questions or thoughts that you want to bring on this one, or should we move on to the other one?
Yeah, move on.
Sounds great. Okay, so this one I have, and I kept going back between what species it should be, so I just set a thrush. But for fun, let's call it an American robin. Just because those guys are fun. So we've got an American robin, or whatever other small songbird you might like to think of, who's on 1 month of cage rest because of a fractured ulna. So they're in some pretty restricted caging, you know, for their health. And this is some of what's going on here. You know, they don't have a lot of different proteins that the place is able to give them. So they're pretty unvaried in that, but otherwise their diet is varied. Quality of the food is really good. They're inside, they've got the appropriate heating for their state of health. They don't have UV access. You can see there isn't that acute wing injury, but they are on the appropriate pain medication. Poor muscle tone, but a good body condition score. I will let you guys start reading this, and I see lots of things coming in, so I will start typing.
Is it helpful for me to read some of these out to you, Kai, or is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So it looks like you've already got vitamin deficiency. Due to the lack of UV, we've also got a loss of the muscle mass and wing strength due to the restriction. And Joan is saying that they will need to bounce around, so a need for ground food. So I think we have a positive from Tina, which is that their pain is under control and their food is allowing them to want to eat, and their feathers are looking good. Looks like you already have stress from predators. That's great. We've got enrichment for a positive from Carol. Looks like we have a much more balanced positive and negative situation for this case. No co-specifics, which could increase the stress and would reduce habituation to humans. Okay, I think we have a suggestion for something that could be changed from Joan. The cage could be more spread out and lower so that they could move without flying until the ulna is healed.
I like the one I just saw from Franny, cage floor foraging to encourage, and I don't know that we want to, I mean, in this case, I would think, and Katie or any other vets on here, please chime in, because sometimes with cage rest, you really want them not moving around too much, but I could see foraging as a way to still, without them moving very much, to allow them something interesting to do. That would be a fairly safe, I would think, for a ground species like a thrush.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a good example, Kai, of the compromise that you have to have in wildlife rehabilitation, or indeed in any situation where the animals are undergoing treatment, is that you ideally would want to provide it perhaps with a more diverse environment, but the veterinary treatment restricts that because you don't want to contaminate dressings or anything else like that. So that there might be a period in rehabilitation where the animal, you have to accept that there might be some more negative experiences than positive just because of the treatment the animal is undergoing. But then as you're getting closer to release, you should be, getting the animal used to more positive experiences, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot of what I was hoping this one would kind of show us. I think that's the challenge of rehab, right? We're not going to have wonderful welfare the entire time. And part of our challenge is to assess length of welfare situations and what might be coming next. And I think that makes assessing welfare in rehab even more challenging. The paper that I linked in there, that's the most recent one from David Meller, talks a lot about captive animals, like long-term captive animals, and how to assess their welfare. And in rehab, and there are some other papers and things out there to help assess welfare of animals in the wild. But we're in this weird, this intermittent spot where we need to kind of look at both and look at all of that together. So I think rehabilitators have a really unique challenge here. This is a lot of what I wanted us to get out of these scenarios, to just kind of get an idea of how these go together. I know a few of these things I put on here maybe aren't necessarily mental states. You'd go one more from this, from loss of strength, might be there's, it's more the lack of the next level of mental state caused by the loss of strength and the vitamin deficiencies. I mean, you know how you feel when you're sick, it's things of that sort. Especially when you add those things into the stress of being with predators and then feeling like you don't have the ability to get away and you're weak. You can imagine how that goes. So I might not have the perfect wording here, but it gives you a really good idea of how this part of the exercise works. Anything anybody else wants to add in on these? Otherwise, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can get to the really fun part, the general discussion.
Yeah, it looks like we have a suggestion for white noise from Fran for a change that can be made. Oh, and from Jean also, natural ambient sounds.
I wanted to just add in, I don't know, I think as humans, it's probably difficult for us to understand how stressful not being able to fly is, just in general, since we just run away, but birds, that's their main way to escape.
Yeah, that's a really important one to add in, actually, since this will be shared with people afterwards. I think that's, how would it be stress from lack of flight, or what would be the?
It's an inability to express usual normal behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And then the frustration that would come from that.
All right.
Now, this is a great list, and I also think it's really positive how Adam pointed out several times the kind of like the natural desire to anthropomorphize animals a little bit, but the language that we're using is really focused on those positive and negative affects, and not speaking about it in terms of human emotion, which is great.
Yeah, I think we've gone from feeling like we can't use emotions and things at all because it's anthropomorphizing, to realizing animals have this and being able to balance that in. I've seen some people, especially in zoos, I've sat in a few talks from zoos doing animal welfare work. And one thing they do, especially when there's a challenge, is they'll have a team doing some of these assessments. And some of those will be people who are very close to the situation. Some of those will be people who are a little bit further apart. And that can really help, where you're really thinking about the mental state, working on that, but bringing in less of our personal bias and feelings. Similar to, I guess, how we often have to do when we're talking about euthanasia decisions. Even if we're working alone, we might, kind of phone a friend and talk to a fellow rehabilitator, even if they're in another country, to walk through what's going on.
All righty. Well, I just look like we're about at the end of our time. Unless anybody wants to chime in with any last thoughts, I think we can say thank you to Adam for that wonderful presentation. It seems like this model is certainly helpful for decision making, for hard decision making, and just generally for ensuring that we're giving the best possible care, considering the animals' welfare and not just our perspective of what they need and want. So thank you all for joining us. These chats are so helpful and really wonderful for us, and we hope they are for you too. So we will be having another one next month. So keep an eye on our Facebook or your emails for the next month's topic. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a happy new year, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
See ya.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye.